Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. Previous guests on this podcast have included Rob Wagner, Roy Moran, and Meredith Johnson. You can subscribe to this podcast and go back and listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Drew Hyun. Drew is the founder and pastor of Hope Church Midtown, as well as the founding pastor of Hope Church NYC, which is a family of diverse churches in and around New York City. Drew is also a part of the Emotionally Healthy Discipleship team, a movement that is dedicated to transforming church culture through the multiplication of deeply changed leaders and disciples. Enjoy this conversation. It's deep and it's rich. You're going to get a lot out of it. Time to take some notes. Here's Drew. Drew, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you on. So thanks for coming.
Oh, it's an honor to be here, man. And really admire you and the work that you do. And how you've been such a mobilizer and someone who helps people reimagine what mission looks like.
Thanks. Yeah, it's really exciting to do what I do, and it's exciting to do what you do. Last year, I actually was sitting in on a webinar with you last year. You called it Subversive Multiplication. And that saying and that phrase and what you talked about stuck with me all year long. And months down the road afterwards, I took a few of those things and talked about the way that we walk the path is really important, to go deep, to actually slow down, to multiply. What's your story of slow down multiplication? How did you get into this place of slowing down your life?
Yeah, I think, a big part of it is my own background of unhealth.
Yeah.
And I should say it's coupled with, right, because there's selfish ambition and then there's holy ambition.
Yeah.
I would like to think that I fall far more in the holy ambition part. But the reality is I came from a very driven background and family. And so, my father was a very strong, driven person, workaholic, kind of immigrant hustle was kind of in my blood. Yeah. And so as a result, it's just kind of innate in me. So I'm a natural dreamer who's thinking about moving and what's next and how do we build and expand and grow. And, I would like to think that, the beauty of that is that's from God, and it's kind of led me down kind of unique pathways, but it also has its shadow side, as does anything. And that shadow has led me into seasons of burnout, seasons of being overworked, seasons of being unaware of like, what are the driving forces in me when things happen. And so I think I would say what led me to slow down was really the pain of realization of my own makeup, how it affects me and the people around me. And then that realization leading me to a place of, for a lifetime of ministry, if I'm someone who wants to start and continue and finish well, I really like health ultimately is the most significant thing. And I think by God's providence, I was, in my early 20s, I started as an intern at New Life Fellowship, which is the church that Pete Scazzaro founded. Pete is the author of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality and Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. And Pete became a really significant discipler and mentor for me to really show me a path of what does it look like to be before we do, and to set real significant practices in my life and anchors that would really keep me tethered to Jesus in the midst of the craziness and the busyness that is ministry life. And so I think all of those things, I really do feel like it's God's providence, because I can totally see someone like myself, making really poor choices, or not knowing how to handle my anxiety, or being overly driven and committing to too many things, which I still do at times, but hopefully it's been mitigated by a real commitment to wanting to do this in an emotionally healthy way. And so So I think all of those things were the things that helped slow me down and then tether me to a place of like, ultimately, the most significant thing that I can offer to anyone is my life with Jesus. And
Mm-hmm.
so if that's the case, then that needs to be paramount.
Yeah.
And so I would say those are the things that really kind of slowed me down or helped me to realize just how important this is.
Yeah, and it's a difficult thing. I lived in South Korea for 2 years, and so I worked
Wow.
with Koreans. I was at a church in Korea, and taught English at the school that the church started, and so I know that Koreans, especially Korean
Yeah.
Christians, they go from 5 a.m. to
Oh, yeah.
10, 11 p.m. at night, and they barely get any sleep. A lot of my students, they didn't see their father very much during the year because he was off working, he was doing things. And, your dad coming in as an immigrant into the States, there's this immigrant hustle, right, that you inherited as well. But then you have this Korean culture as well. How do
Mm.
you shift from this nonstop, hard go, like everything's about doing, to this thing that Pete Scazzaro was talking about, be grounded and rooted and about being rather than doing? It must have taken years to be able to shift the culture that you were surrounded with.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's why I say pain was kind of one of the catalysts. And I think also like a theological understanding of it, because in many ways, like one of my friends who works in a lot of 12-step settings, one of the things that he talks about is how, some people are addicted to the stuff that at 12-step meetings, people would say, okay, it's bad to be addicted to those things, right? Like
Yeah.
it's, like alcohol, sex, drugs, those things that we might look at and say, like, to be an addict of those things, of course. There's a certain kind of addiction that I carry, though, which is equally addictive, but in many ways, it's in some ways more insidious because
Mm.
the world can applaud me for it.
Mm. Yeah.
So, for instance, by being someone who works really hard, right? Like by being someone who's up early and basically I'm addicted to work,
Yeah.
and it gets applauded. Like Drew is such a hard worker. Drew is so sacrificial. Drew will go above and beyond. And so as a result, like I wasn't even aware. And so like I remember when, for instance, let's take the practice of Sabbath keeping.
Mm-hmm.
When that came on my radar, it was kind of like, well, Sabbath keeping is so Old Testament. Like, why would I brag? That's like an old Jesus freed us
Yeah.
so that I wouldn't have to keep Sabbath, you know? But little did I know, when investigating kind of like where Sabbath was given in the story of Israel, where it was given, and the gift that it was given, and what it was meant to be a marker for God's people, that they are not driven by work. They're not driven by what they produce. And it's coming out of slavery,
Yeah.
right? And like God gives this command, like, I command you to be able to rest. And that, like, especially after 400 years of slavery, I command you to know that your identity is not found in what you produce.
Mm.
And for me, it was kind of like this unlocking, like, oh my goodness. I used to, when it came to Sabbath keeping, I used to say that's so Old Testament and legalistic. Can't believe I am free from the shackles of Old Testament traditions, that now I can be free to be a workaholic.
Yeah.
And it was this reframing of like, wait a minute, like what am I saying? Like I'm arguing a case for being a workaholic and being so defined by my work,
Mm.
when the gospel that I preach in front of people is a
Yeah.
gospel of grace and God's favor that's
Mm.
not based on what I've done, but on what Jesus has done. And so if that's the case, then why am I living law and preaching
Mm.
grace? And even as it relates to Sabbath keeping. And so I think that even that shift mentally of like, and like I would use passages like, there's that account where Jesus, on the Sabbath, he's being questioned about what he does on the Sabbath. And there's a
Right.
person with a shriveled hand.
Yeah.
And that person gets healed. And then Jesus makes that teaching, of course, right? Man was not made for Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man. And whenever I would look at that passage, I would actually I would put myself in that story as Jesus. Like, because I mean, look at what Jesus did on the Sabbath. I
Hmm.
should be doing that on the Sabbath too. But then I remember as this shift was happening in my own mind about Sabbath being a gift to really live out the gospel message of freedom and rest and working from a place of rest. I realized, like, even in that story, my mindset started to change where, wait a minute, in that story, I'm not Jesus. I'm the man with the shriveled hand.
Yeah, it's
Like, and what
good.
Jesus is saying is like, he's the one that's actually restoring me on Sabbath. He's the one that restores the man with the shriveled hand on
Mm.
Sabbath. He bucks through all the traditions and he's the one that restores. And in the same way, there's in many ways, I'm someone with a shriveled hand. I'm someone with, and I need to be restored every Sabbath. And so even that, that, so I think that had to change. And then, of course, like you mentioned, like some real painstaking, like what does the practice of it look like?
Yeah.
And so, because like you said, man, like I was, I was smiling just as you were talking about working in Korea. Like, man, I know that rigor. That is
Hmm.
a
That was
talk
tough.
about hustle. Yeah, talk about
Woo.
hustle, man. Yeah. So,
I mean, man, I was at a like the church had a boarding school. There were like second graders to eighth graders, and I mean, they get them up at 5 a.m., go to the chapel and pray, and they didn't send them to bed until 10, and they maybe they had lunch break and stuff, and they maybe had an hour of play all day
mhm,
long, and
yeah.
it's just go go go, and that's second grade students. Come on. I mean,
Yeah, I know. Oh man, I'm like shivering just thinking about. Yeah.
that
Welcome
was
to my life, man.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was rough. But man, it was transformational. I mean, that was the place where I actually finally got on my knees and I told God that He could do whatever He wants with my life. Like that was where I remember in
Mm,
the dorm room of that little school, just on my knees crying and saying, "Okay, Jesus, you're now really Lord. I'm not doing this for you anymore. I want you to lead me
mm,
and guide me and show me where to go."
yeah.
And it was it was strange. God started to speak to me about Arab Muslims while I was there in South Korea. There are no Arab Muslims in South Korea.
Mm,
And then, 6 months later, I met my wife on eHarmony, and the first
wow.
message she sent me was, "I want to live and work in the Middle East, and if you're not up for
Wow.
that, we don't have to talk." And so that
Wow.
that really, Korea helped me a lot and gave me this place of surrender to Jesus,
Mm,
even in the midst of this hardworking, like striving culture that I was in. I knew that I'm done striving. I needed that surrender. And so surrendering is huge. And it actually transformed life and mission. And I've able to see disciples made because of my surrender as opposed to my striving for God.
mm.
How do we get to a place of living our life with God and not for Him?
Yeah. I think it takes, especially in our culture, I think it takes an enormous amount of intentionality
Mm-hmm.
because the air that we breathe, so much of the culture that we live in the West, especially, is so built on results and
Yep.
outcome. And I would say even in ministry worlds, right? Like so much of it, and I'm someone who very much values organizational principles and business practices when it relates to it. But because nowadays so much of the measurements of what success looks like is these metrics that end up being really kind of markers that drive us. I think it needs enormous amounts of intentionality.
Yeah.
Eugene Peterson has this phrase in his book, The Contemplative Pastor. He says, "You are busy because you are lazy." And I remember reading that and thinking, like, what do you mean you're busy because you're lazy? Like,
Wow.
I would think that busy people are actually really, really like industrious, and they're the people
Yeah.
that I want on my team.
Yeah.
And what he writes is, no, 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 you're busy because you're lazy about not doing the hard work of prioritizing what comes first.
Mm.
And So for me, like that starts with certain practices for me of like, okay, what are the things before any work is accomplished?
Yeah.
What are the things that I'm going to stay rooted and committed to so that my life with Jesus and my life with my first neighbor, my wife and my children,
Yeah.
becomes paramount to me. And so for me, those practices are Sabbath keeping, and crafting a rule of life. A rule of life
Hmm.
being basically, a framework by which Jesus is at the center of everything that I do.
Yeah.
And so I think it takes enormous intentionality, um, to be with God. And I only say that because I realize that, I think the journey for most people, especially in vocational ministry, is like, okay, have this life changing awareness of God. Then immediately I'm thrown into the active life, right? Like
Yeah.
you're part of these groups and Bible studies and outreaches and whatever else. And, and so much of it is learning these external disciplines. And then there comes this period of disillusionment of like, wait a minute, like, why am I doing all this?
Right.
And has this really made me a more loving human being? And I think usually it's then that people start going through the inward path or the downward path of just kind of like reflecting on like what all these practices are for and what all these external things can be about.
Yeah.
And that's where I think a life of contemplation before God and um,
Mm.
so for myself, I think it's really putting together these practices, but having these practices have a mixture of contemplation and prayer before God.
Yeah.
And that allows me to really sift through different motives here and there,
Yeah.
So
As you're practicing your rule of life and you're being very intentional of ordering life around Jesus, and um, have you found a place? Does your church or your community do a common rule of life where you have some shared practices as a rule, or have you seen that happen, and is that effective?
yeah, our church, especially during the pandemic, we did create like a church rule of life.
Hmm.
And, we'd bring it up at every uh, town hall, state of the church that we did. Um, and I think what's different, obviously, in the Western context versus like, in the Ignatian communities where the rules were created and like there was like common buy-in with everyone.
Yeah.
Obviously, in the Western world, which happens to be so individualistic, it's hard for people to really center around a rule. So what we try to do is we try to do what's taught and then what's caught, right? So what's
Hmm.
taught is we will continue to teach on crafting a rule of life. And then what's caught is a culture, um, a culture of Jesus, a culture that's driven not by programs, but by people and
Mm.
by prayer and by rest. Um, and especially in a place like New York City. So for us, it's an invitation. So we do have a common rule that our church has been invited to. Our two of our discipleship courses, emotionally healthy spirituality and emotionally healthy relationships, the last week is always focused on crafting a rule of life for
Hmm.
oneself. So we're constantly using the language of, hey, how are we going to remain tethered to Jesus in the midst of all of this?
Yeah.
And so we're constantly training people on how to craft a rule of life so that Jesus becomes the center. And how does that rule shape the decisions that I make and things like that. And so it's actually really like I mean, one example is on Saturdays. People know that my Sabbath is on Saturdays,
Hmm.
and you, like so I don't do work. I don't respond to messages. I'm not available. And so, but we live in this parsonage space here in Midtown.
Hmm.
And one of the groups, like our young adult community, meets on Saturday mornings. Um, Saturday mornings at 11 a.m. It's like a brunchy kind of group and stuff. And so there's a number of them that are there. And one of the funny things is like sometimes because I live in a parsonage, like I'll see them sometimes
Yeah.
and they'll see me. And then, we'll just chit chat here or there, and they'll be like, Drew, we know it's your Sabbath though, man. Just, thanks for saying hi or whatever. And um, it's just, it's great. It's like, it's now embedded in the culture. Like it's embedded
Yeah.
in the language that we use. Like, hey, this is Sabbath, and this is, you know, uh, Drew and his rule of life. What it means is this is the rhythms by which they're gonna, one of the rhythms that we keep is every 3 years we take a 3 month sabbatical.
Mm.
And so this year we're taking another 3 month sabbatical. And so we've had 3 3 month sabbaticals, and this is on
Wow.
top of taking 4 to 6 weeks every year. We have a 3 month sabbatical coming up. This is our third one in the
Wow.
10-year history of our church, and so and people just know, like, it's just part of our rhythm, like, and that
Mm.
we are a place that the rhythm is rest and work, and or rest and mission, if you want to use that language.
Yeah.
So
I saw a Christian leader on Instagram post that you don't need a sabbatical. I've never taken a sabbatical. It's not going to help with your burnout, right? And so
mm,
it's not really about not going to be, burning out. There's a different purpose for this, for
yeah.
a sabbatical. What's the purpose of a sabbatical? To be able to take this time away.
Yeah, well, so I would actually say, and I mean, it's really based on what a biblical Sabbath looks like. And if you read like Walter Brueggemann, or even like Pete Scazzaro,
Hmm.
the four elements of Sabbath that we often teach about are: one is to stop, and to rest, right? So
Yeah.
stopping, seizing, that's part of what Sabbath means. To rest, to delight. So Sabbath is a foretaste of heaven, as it talks about in the book of Hebrew. And then to contemplate. And contemplating simply means focusing, like our silence. What's different between silence and solitude of a Christian versus silence and solitude for someone from some other tradition is that our silence is unto the Lord. And so stopping, resting, delighting, and contemplating. So whenever we're crafting our Sabbath or sabbatical, we're thinking about those four things: stopping from work
Yeah.
and resting. Is it going to be restful? Is it going to be delightful? Is it like a taste of heaven? Because that's what Sabbath is supposed to be. And is it something where, like, my centeredness is in the Lord? It's not just like some extended vacation.
Yeah.
And so for me, I'll tell you what, like, what's been really fascinating, even in the conversation around subversive multiplication, like sabbaticals, like on one end, they're restful and really replenishing for me.
Yeah.
But on another hand, the stopping is excruciating.
Yeah.
It feels like dying.
Mm.
And but I need that discipline in my life. The discipline of dying to, because here's what happens every sabbatical. I need to stop to a point as if I died.
Yeah.
And what that forces me to do then is say, oh my goodness, am I ready to let go of all the things that I feel like I'm responsible for? And I mean, this will sound very egocentric. All the stuff that I've done and I've built.
Yeah.
And what happens every sabbatical is I need to be able to walk away and say, Lord, my ego is not wrapped up in how that goes or survives. I've done what I can do so that it lives beyond me.
Mm.
Now help me to walk away in such a manner where um, my identity and my ego is not wrapped up in all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And so in an interesting way, it's actually like a really good discipline for me. So it's not only restful, it's painful,
Yeah.
because the stopping, um, you know, it really allows me to confront my mortality, my
Mm.
sense of grandiosity, my sense of, like, it's had me work on succession, so
Mm.
like the idea of succession, like every 3 years I'm in a succession plan,
Yeah.
because I'm I'm creating a pathway for myself to walk away
Mm.
and to say, God, and it's a time for me to center on God and ask, like, God, is this, yeah, your will be done, not my will. is there any part of me that needs to walk away from this, that needs my ego to die related to some of this, And so that's been my experience. But what is interesting is kind of like what you said, like I hear that a lot of pastors or even parishioners, one of the things that I've heard a lot is whenever they hear that a pastor is going on a sabbatical, they think that that pastor is going to leave.
Right.
Because they think that that pastor is burnt out, or that's just code for like, I've had it with you. And, I think we've built a culture now at our church where people see it's just part of the normal rhythm. And it's part of like, hey, we really like the reason why our sabbatical culture exists is because I knew that like I have generations of workaholism. You talked about the Korean, DNA, the Korean Christian DNA.
Yeah.
Like it's so in me that I need some really significant disciplines and markers that keep me from my workaholism.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. When I was thinking, when Jesus gave the Great Commission, he said to his disciples to go all nations, baptize people in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teach people to obey everything that I've commanded. That making disciples is teaching people to obey something. And in our Western mind, obey seems very much of a striving mentality, a doing mentality, a workaholic mentality to obey those things. How can we make disciples in such a way where it preserves some emotional health?
The reason why emotionally healthy discipleship, is part of our pathway is because number one, I think the disciple making process first tends to be very external and practice driven, which it can be for sure. And one of the reasons why we have introduced the emotionally healthy discipleship courses, right? The emotionally healthy spirituality, emotionally healthy relationships, is because we want to invite people to a discipleship that goes beneath the surface, that allows people to ask questions, not only about like, hey, just do this, this, and this, and this, not just a to-do list, but like, how is the Lord coming to you in your grief and loss? How is the Lord coming to you in your, and so just a life of reflection and contemplation, I think is really important. And I think that life of reflection and contemplation, I think if I'm discipling someone in emotionally healthy discipleship, one of the dangers, honestly, of talking about it so much is that everyone around me knows whether I'm really living what we're talking about,
Right. Yep.
Because we're talking about being prayerfully present with people. And we're talking about like not a program. We're talking about like being like, and so the question for people around me is Drew someone who embodies a kind of non-anxious being before God?
Yeah.
Is he someone who demonstrates that kind of life? Or when I'm around him, do I feel on edge? Do I feel like I have to get things done? Do I feel like I have to do all this stuff? And so I think a big part of it first is just this invitation to be first, And so for me, it's first me as a discipler. How am I being before I'm doing or asking anyone to do anything? What does my presence communicate to people? What does my life with my family look like? What does, and so that whole idea of what's caught and then what's taught.
Yeah.
So I think number one is I think it's just like being focused first on what's caught, like being the kind of person that's deeply committed to an emotionally healthy discipleship pathway. And then secondly, as it relates to, making disciples and having it be less striving oriented and obey, I mean, the beautiful thing about Jesus is, he says in Matthew 11, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. you know. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't lead us into hard things, right?
Yeah.
Because of course he leads us into suffering and at times and hard sacrifices that we have to make. But ultimately, if my being is rooted in Jesus, then of course his yoke is easy, his burden is light. And so I think that invitation, so for me, um, and this is where Sabbath keeping and sabbaticals also, because my tendency is to want control and striving. Like that's my tendency
Yep.
when it comes to everything. Like
Yep.
my wife and I, when we moved into this new apartment, I was really agitated and I had to go see my counselor just to like, and he whittled it back down to like, yeah, like the boxes everywhere. Like it just gives me this lack of sense of control.
Mm.
And it was such a revealing moment for me of like control. Like I want, and so much of life for me is the ability to just let go of that, and
Mm-hmm.
so as it relates to emotionally healthy disciple making that doesn't feel striving oriented, I think if I'm focused on my being, and I'll give you this example, and sorry if I'm rambling a bit here,
No, this
but
is great.
my like during the pandemic, in Manhattan, the COVID hit New York City really hard, and 50% of our congregation left.
Wow.
Either they moved away out of the city. Now, in the outer boroughs, we're in Manhattan. In the outer boroughs, there was a lot of sickness and death. So
Mm.
it was just, and many people wrote about the demise of New York and, how people were going to leave the city. The city will never be the same. We lost 50% of our folks, our folks,
Yeah.
they're still, and then they ended up, then 30% of our budget was down. And we made some necessary cuts here and there and everything, but like in a weird way, like I'm not so much of so much of the task for me during the pandemic was of course to be a non-anxious presence, to trust.
Yeah.
But like I had to double down on this, like being before doing. Like though we're in a season of desert and pain and loss,
Hmm.
how can and then all the control things, right? Like, oh my goodness, I'm losing control. And
Yeah.
it was really this moment of like, okay, how do I continue? There's so many things beyond my control. How do I just continue to remain someone who loves Jesus and loves others well in the
Mm-hmm.
midst of what's happening? And so I really do think that, it is the seasons of failure and suffering and
Yeah.
setback that really forge the kind of disciple making, the kind of being that
Yeah.
we want to impart to others around us.
Yeah. I mean, I'm praying, the same thing for our church here in Kansas City, that,
Mhm.
we've lost, half of our congregation as well, that, we're in home churches across the city, and we meet once a month as a whole community. And, that health that we have is strong because we actually have some really strong bonds one to another, and
Yeah, I love
actual
it.
presence.
Hmm.
And so my hope and my prayer in this is that we have shrunk to the place that we need to get to so that we can grow and we can multiply and we can see more of Jesus's presence across the city,
Yeah.
and more of an impact. And, so that's my prayer. That's my prayer for you in New York, what that happens. Um,
Mm.
but, I've talked to so many people lately, and you're one of them now, is that presence one to another and presence with God, presence with Jesus
Hmm.
is the thing that's going to transform us. It's
Yeah.
the presence. It's not the doing or the striving. It's not the activity, but it's about being present, and intentional. What
Yeah.
is it about presence?
I mean, I think it's, one of the beautiful things about Jesus is he, like in all his healings, he doesn't just line up all the blind people and be like, okay, you're all healed. there's like all these interesting, unique little ways in which he heals people and what he says to them. And there's just this customized, it's like this way of seeing people like Jesus. And I think I think there's something so beautiful in that,
Yeah.
and I think being prayerfully present with people, especially in a space that is so, especially with all the talk about technology and media and the virtual world. I mean, ultimately, nothing beats presence,
Mm-hmm.
and um, and that, I mean, that's really what the incarnation is all about.
Yeah.
And I do think that will be a healing pathway in this next season for so many, and ultimately, nothing will ever replace uh, the embodied body of Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah,
The
so
so the question I have, I think a lot of people when they say, "Hey, I want to enter in, I want to be present for somebody," they don't know how to do it. They
yeah,
don't know
yeah,
how to be present and
right,
how to
right.
ask questions and actually how to see what God is doing in the life of the person in front of them.
Mhm.
How do we go about being a good presence to people?
Yeah, no, that's a great. So, I mean, and sorry if I keep harping on this, but like, we have a course called Emotionally Healthy Relationships,
Hmm.
and we teach skills, 8 skills, and those skills are basically, how do we have healthy relationships? How do we listen to another person?
Mm.
you know and so we actually have these skills, and then we practice them, and again, that's part of our discipleship pathway, because most people aren't necessarily taught how to be a loving presence. Most people are just told love as Jesus loved.
Yeah.
Now we have clues, like there's text like in the book of James that talks about be slow to speak, quick to listen, slow to anger. And so we actually have a skill called incarnational listening as part of the emotional healthy relationship skills, where
Mm.
we teach people, how do you listen well?
Yeah, that's so good.
And what's interesting is that in seminary, I had to take two classes, semester long classes on preaching,
Yeah.
but I never had to take any classes or courses on listening.
Hmm.
And it's
Wow.
it's interesting. I think someone was telling me, like, the evangelical world, evangelicals are known for having a lot to say,
Yep.
but aren't necessarily really good at listening.
Hmm.
And listening does not mean agreeing. Listening does not mean,
Yeah.
right. Like, listening just simply means being present with someone.
Yeah.
And um and so I would highly commend the emotional healthy relationships course, because what we're trying to do is, how do we live out biblical
Hmm.
principles of being a loving presence? And um and so yeah, so that's what I would say in terms of someone is, there's real tools to be able to, how do
Yeah.
we grow in this idea of being present with one another? And of course, so many others, even in the missional conversation, have talked about, like, eating meals with people
Right.
and listening to their stories and things like that, which I very much
Yeah.
agree with, and things like that. So
Yeah. When I was living in the Middle East and working with Syrian refugees, they had a saying. It said they said "Sarbena hubsamila," and after we ate together, they said, "Oh, it
mm,
has now happened between us, bread and salt." It literally means that now we could go deep. Now we could be friends because we've eaten
wow,
together.
that's amazing. Yeah.
And so we saw a marked difference between receptivity of Jesus between the people that we have eaten with and the people we have not eaten with. Uh,
Mm,
People were willing to listen and hear and accept our presence and our place within their family when we've eaten with them. And so it's
mm,
really important that we sit and we eat or we are present with people. It's just the nature of humans and human
yeah.
existence. We're going to
Yes.
start to trust when we are with one another.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's really
no,
good.
right on. That's so beautiful. I love what you said there. Yeah.
Yeah. So what does it look like? So if you're looking at all of this uh, Sabbath, sabbatical, being present with people, loving presence, how does that inform our mission and our mandate from Christ to go um, and make disciples? What does it look like when we take all of that to be able to do that? How does it inform what we do?
Yeah, I think so because a lot of times these things are pitted against each other.
Yep.
Like, the missional conversation is kind of like you guys are just, you know, sitting around not doing anything and not getting anything done. And then the prayer folks are looking at them and being like, you guys are so driven, and that's where all the unhealth comes from and things like that. And I would like to think, obviously Jesus modeled both,
Yep.
right? Like he modeled going away to pray and silence and solitude and tight relationships and then public ministry. And so I think the key to that then is rhythm.
Mm.
Like, what's the rhythm?
Yeah.
And I think one of the differences is because I think, usually the Western mindset is we work so that we can go on vacation. In other words, we work so that we can rest. But I mean, Sabbath keeping and even the commandment to keep a Sabbath and the fact that it starts at the beginning, it's an invitation to work from our rest.
Yeah.
And I think there's a significant difference there, either working for rest or working from rest.
Yep.
And I think not only practically and rhythmically, but also on a very kind of immaterial way, right? Like when my heart is in a place of rest, when I'm in a place where I'm not striving, right? And this is the difference between selfish ambition and holy ambition.
Yep.
When I'm in a place where I'm being with Jesus, and then as I'm being with Jesus, then I'm going and making disciples. It's a much different texture than like, okay, I've done my time with Jesus. Now I gotta, put my work in and do this and that. It's like, no. My whole life is a life of contemplation. And so I think, so what's hard is I think that most people, especially in the West, because again, we juxtapose these and we divide them up. Like, I would like to contend that they can be one and the same.
Yeah.
That if what I'm offering is a being with Jesus, and that's part of what mission looks like. Mission is being with Jesus and then having people catch it, and then me teaching it, and then me kind of living it, and then imparting it, and then living with the results, And so, so that's what I would say, I think.
I think that's beautiful because it's very holistic. It's very much a life with Jesus, not a compartmentalized life with Jesus. It's a whole life. And we need that, right? And that's why we also need the body. We need one another, that we need each other to speak into our weaknesses, and us to speak into others' weaknesses. And we complement one another, and we start to move and work together in this. And, I think a lot of people in the West, because we're so individualistic, we think about all of these things in an individual setting and a place. We think about Joshua doing missions. Like, I'm the one that's going out. It's not just me. I need others to be able to go out. Jesus said, you have to go out at least 2 by 2. We need others to go with you. So it's about the body. It's about coming together, and it's not about compartmentalizing. So I love what you say. It's very good.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions here at the end. One, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh man, that's such a great question. I mean, I think it's the Julian of Norwich um, quote, right? Like, all will be well, all will be well, all manner of things will be well.
Mm,
Like, I think my 21-year-old self was so full of striving and wanting, it was just so full of striving.
yeah.
And I think I would just tell myself, hey, relax. It's going to be okay. Relax. So, yeah, that's what I
Yeah,
would say.
that's good. And then have you been reading anything or watching anything lately that you could recommend?
Yeah, reading. I mean, I'm constantly immersed in like uh, the emotionally healthy stuff. But I've been reading. There's this book that a few people recommended called "Tattoos on My Heart" by Greg Boyle,
Mm,
who's a Catholic priest who does some amazing work with
mm,
um, gangs in LA and um, really amazing stories of
mm.
life change and yet at the same time pain and heartache. And
Yeah,
I think it just gives such a window into what ministry is like. So
mm, that's great. That's good. Well, Drew, how can people connect with what you're doing in New York or anywhere else?
yeah, I mean, I would say around the emotional health conversations, emotionallyhealthy.org, which I'm part of that team with Pete Scazzaro and big fans of kind of what we're doing and just trying to impart emotionally healthy disciple making. And then our family of church is called Hope Church NYC, and I'm the lead pastor of Hope Midtown. And yeah, if anyone would like to connect, would be glad to. But yeah, really grateful.
Great. Well, Drew, I really appreciate it. It was really great. And, I don't, really feel any striving from you. I felt presence, and I felt that you are rooted in Jesus and who he is in your life. And so it was just a privilege to sit with you and to be present with you and have this conversation. So thank you.
Thanks, Joshua. And yeah, like same, just really appreciate you, the conversation, and hearing of your experiences too are pretty extraordinary. Living in these different places, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Thanks. All
yeah.
right. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.